Dear learners and listeners, welcome to Indira Gandhi National Open University. Today's topic is Interrogating Gender Gaps in Economy. This topic is part of the course BGSC 001. Myself Dr. G. Uma, faculty in the School of Gender and Development Studies, Indira Gandhi National Open University. Let me introduce the topic. As you all aware, gender inequality is existing in both developed and developing countries. The gender gaps are more visible in many indicators in the developing countries due to patriarchy and socialization process. The gaps between male and female in various indicators like education, earnings, occupation, access to formal employment, access to managerial position, access to productive inputs, political representation, or bargaining power inside the household are visible in developing countries like India. If you look at the estimate of gender gaps in schooling, Dollar and Katie estimated gender gaps in schooling in the year 1999. As per 1990 data, they have grouped the poorest countries in one group. Among poorest countries, only 5% of adult women had any secondary education. That is, when we compared that women's secondary education, they are only 5% had a secondary education compared to male, that is one half of the level of men in that poorest countries. At the same time, among richest countries, 51% of the adult women had secondary education. When we compare to male members of this 51%, it is 88 of the level of male in the richest countries. The gender gaps in employment and pay getting reduced in much faster in developing countries than it happened in industrial countries. That was studied by the researchers in the year 1990. Reduction in gender gaps, that is also fast reducing compared to the developing countries that it happened during industrialized countries and developed countries. Gender inequality is highly prevalent in South Asia and the Middle East and North America, according to Kyasan and Lamana in the year 2009. Gender inequality can be assessed through informal economy and household economy. We can easily assess the gender inequality. So today we are going to interrogate how this gender inequality is existing in economy, both formal and informal economy and household economy. Notable percentage of women are part of the informal economy. Studies further proved women's contribution in subsistence work and family work in both productive and reproductive works. Women are unpaid in the family. Most of the time, women's work is not valued or counted. Women are also underrepresented among top positions, both developed and developing countries. The average incidence of female among managers is less than 30%, that is according to World Bank data in 2001. The data also shows that less percentage of women employed in industrial sector. Women are also part of the global labor in the informal sector, especially 2/3 of the global labor force in garment production is female and 1/5 of the total female labor force is in manufacturing. So now let us see, after giving the introduction, now let us see the origin of gender inequality in economy. Economics, both formal and informal economy. Women inequality in the economy realized after the study carried out by the Esther Boschru in Africa on agricultural sector. Globally, feminists and policymakers realized the inclusion of women in the economy after pursuing women in development approach based on Esther Boschru study. The women in development approach, that is WID approach, emerged in 1970 and formally accepted by many countries to formulate policies based on WID in the first International Women's Conference held in the year 1975. According to Cecilia Berlanga, Alessio Robles, quote, the WID movement advocated for gender equality. However, its central and more popular discourse was based on economic efficiency arguments, also known as the gender efficiency approach. This approach was based on the idea that when women have access to education, jobs, credits, and assets, they are able to contribute substantially to the society's economic growth and catalyze its development process. Unquote. Now let me explain. I talked about the WID. Now let me explain WID and GAD. You all know WID approach. They have developed the WID approach after realizing that the women are not part of the economic activity, so we need to integrate. That is the main reason for developing the WID approach. After WID approach, there was an approach WAD and GAD. The WAD approach, first let me explain the WAD approach, that is Women and Development approach. Women and Development approach, like a WID approach. WID approach basically it talked about the significance of integrating women into the existing economic activities. As per WID approach, the women are not considered on par with male members in the society due to the lack of control over resources, basically economic activities. The feminists thought that if the women formally integrated into the existing economic activities, automatically they will also get economically empowered. If they get economically empowered, their status will improve like a male members in the society, assuming that women already have enough time and space to do economic activities. By dismissing the WID approach, some of the feminists, they have proposed Women and Development approach. The Women and Development approach clearly pointed out that it is not that the women are not contributing for the economic activities. Women, they did contribute for the economic activities, but the problem is that whatever they contribute for the economic activities, it is not valued and recognized. The importance of we must recognize the women's contribution. After critiquing the WID and WAD approach, based on the WID and WAD approach, countries, they did formulate policies and programs and they implemented. After 20 years, actually around in the year 1975, the WID as an approach emerged. From 1975 till 1995, policies were formulated based on WID and WAD approach, and there are many policies evolved and programs were implemented to integrate the women into the existing formal economic system. Like the women were the formal institutions like bank and other institutions, they provided loan for the women to start certain kinds of economic activities. But after implementing policies and programs based on the WID approach, many studies were carried out. They realized that it is not that during that period only whatever the study carried out by the feminists based on the WID approach, it revealed that it is not that women are not contributing for the economic activities. The women did contribute for economic activities, and due to the after giving more economic activities, women, they did suffer. They don't have enough space and time to carry out those economic activities. I was talking about the WID and WAD approach. Women in Development approach Women in Development was started, emerged in 1970s and the late 1980s. Within this approach, 3 different strands of development can be differentiated, that is equality, anti-poverty and efficiency. Before we get into Women in Development, and these different three strands, I was explaining about the WAD and GAD. As you all know, women did contribute for the economic development, but it is not valued and recognized. Then they have realized that it is not about the economic activities that making the women inferior to male in the society, that it is very important to alter the existing gender relations, that once they alter the existing gender relations, there will be equality between male and female. So the gender, based on altering the gender and existing gender relations, gender and development approach emerged. Now I have explained three approaches, that is WID, WAD and GAD. All three approaches are based on providing the economic activities to the women. Based on WID approach, there are three strands, different strands of development can be differentiated, that is equality, anti-poverty and efficiency. Let me explain about the equality approach. The equality approach, that is the equality strand of the women in development approach, was the first to emerge during the 1970s and emphasized that women could not make use of development in productive sphere because opportunities provided to women and men were unequal. The proponents of the equality strand perceived that patriarchy and men's lack of willingness to provide equal opportunities as the main cause of women's unequal ability to make use of opportunities. Then anti-poverty approach. It is in this context that anti-poverty strand evolved in 1970s and early 1980s. The primary reason for poverty was not seen as the direction of mainstream capitalist development or the skewed distribution of resources, but the fact that the poor did not have an access to credit, skill, extension and employment which would increase their income and productivity. Next is the efficiency approach. The seeds of efficiency strand emerged in the 1980s in Copenhagen conference, where the UN mid-decade conference on women was held. The conference was dominated by debates on trade, development and politics. By the late 1980s, it was clear that the burden of structural adjustment, which entitled privatization, deregularization as well as reduction of trade barriers and stabilization policies, that which involves combination of restrictive fiscal measure to reduce government borrowing and monetary tightening, was borne by women. Next, based on the women and development, I have already explained about the women and development. The proponents of women and development approach held the view that the problem was not that women were not integrated into development as assumed by those who held in bid position, but that they were integrated in an unequal way due to global capitalism, which exploited the women's cheaper productive labor than men for profits. The gender and development approach, as I have already explained, the gender and development approach emerged in the late 1980s and early 1990s when participatory approaches and right-based approaches to development became popular. The gender and development approach recognized the relation between women and men as the power relation and sees that such power stems from social construction of gender shaped by social institutions of family, community, market and state. The gender and development approach does not see women as passive victims but agents who are negotiating spaces within their multiple identities. The maternal altruism stereotype and gender equality and productivity gains. There are two strands of thought within GAD approach, namely empowerment and equity. I will explain about the empowerment strand. The empowerment strand of gender and development approach broadened the scope of development theory by addressing issues hitherto not considered relevant in conferences on women. These included oppressive gender relations, ecological destruction and ethics of multinational control over developing countries and so on and so forth. The equity strand outlined by Naila Kabir in the year 1994 states that the combination of women's welfare, empowerment, equality of opportunity, anti-poverty and efficiency strands are required to achieve equitable outcomes. She argues that the dichotomy between practical gender needs and strategic gender needs are artificial. Now we have seen how these three approaches, Bid, Wad and Gad, talked about or interrogating the gaps in the existing economy. After these approaches, currently we are talking about the SDG. Before SDG, there was a Millennium Development Goals. Millennium Development Goal 3 arguing that, quote, in the long run, greater gender equality in access to opportunities, rights and voice can lead to more efficient economic functioning and better institutions with dynamic benefits for investment and growth. The business case for investing in MDG 3 is strong. It is nothing more than smart economics. That is the MDG 3. Now we are talking about the Sustainable Development Goals. The rationale behind MDG 3 assumption is contested as they fail to capture the existing structural discrimination against all the like for example Bid, Wad, Gad. Gad is of course talking about the existing gender relations, but even Millennium Development Goals and Sustainable Development Goals, they fail to address the existing patriarchy and other social institutions and cultural social norms that continue to play a central role in social life, especially in developing and low-income countries. Gender equality, having an equal access to economic resources, equal levels of education and access to labor market, does not necessarily lead to economic growth in every case, nor does it invariably benefit men and women equally. Feminist economists critique the existing assumptions on gender equality and they raised some questions to the mainstream economist. Let me explain about the material altruism, how it is part of the existing economy and how we are assuming that the women can able to contribute for the existing economy without realizing that whether they are contributing or not, whether we are valuing the women's contribution or whether we are recognizing the women's contribution. You all must know that when you interrogate the existing gender equality in the economics, all of must understand the material altruism. The existing assumption and studies pointed out that gender inequality can improve development outcomes for the women as well as children. Women are likely to invest their resources in overall well-being of the children if they have more control over economic resources. According to Cecilia Berlanga Alessio Robles, quote, this argument assumes that children's chances of the healthier life, higher life expectancy and improved quality of life are directly linked to gender equality, that is to women having access to economic resources and being able to choose whether to allocate them. Thus, women's empowerment is regarded as an enhancer of cross-generational social mobility and of long-term social and economic returns, a reason why it is labeled as smart economics, unquote. Studies concluded that in Guatemala and Brazil, the existing studies showed that a higher female share of the household budget is associated with better nutritional status of children as opposed to paternal income. Like women's equality in education is related to the higher level of bargaining power within the household, which is associated with greater participation in reproductive decisions as well as higher quality of care and investments in their children. Patriarchy and socialization process bring implicit and explicit bias towards women and girl children. They lack bargaining power and they may not be part of the household decision making process. For example, most of the developing countries, women are less likely to engage in high-skilled productive work, and their returns on educational investment are lower than those of men. Families have fewer incentives to invest in their education. The male child preference in India and China are the example of existing gender discrimination of women. Cecilia Berlanga Alessio Robles further states that, quote, focusing too narrowly on women's agency in development process involves the risk of excluding men while endorsing and perpetrating opposing stereotypes of male egoism and irresponsibility and female altruism and self-sacrifice. She cited the example of conditional caste transfers programs or schemes for poverty reduction programs. According to her, it has mainstreamed the maternal altruism stereotype as it is at the core of these policies rational, and it is the reason why caste is usually transferred exclusively to women heads of households. The schemes and programs targeting women in developing countries have both positive and negative impacts on the life of the women. For an example, conditional caste transfers have been generally successful in promoting children's school attendance and improving their health and nutritional indicators. Nevertheless, they have also played a major role in reinforcing traditional gender roles. In Ecuador, the conditional caste transfer program, designed as being a remuneration for the work carried out by women in their households, which endorsed the norm that women should undertake unpaid work. It is true that women invest their resources more on the well-being of the entire family. At the same time, the existing social norms, distribution roles, responsibilities, beliefs, rules, values, and identities based on socially constructed nature that inevitably limit and shape women's preferences and choices. Women's empowerment, that is providing them with access to economic resources, control of all resources for improving their association with reproductive responsibilities, does not inevitably lead to economic growth for all. It may leave women out of development process, employing them in undertaking the labor needed to produce and maintain current and future workers that will contribute to the economy. Now let me talk about gender equality and productive gains. According to Cecilia Berlanga Alessio Robles, quote, the assumption that gender equality leads to productivity gains lies in the idea that when women who have been typically excluded from participating from formal economy became active participants, their economic empowerment will have a spillover effect and contribute to overall economic growth. Nevertheless, this has failed to recognize the gender dimensions of human capital and labor that this economic growth entitles. Unquote. There are studies that conclude that the reduction of educational gender inequality has positive outcomes in gross economic growth. A study by Knowles et al., based on cross-country macro-level data for 74 developed and developing countries, found that for every 1% increase in female education, the GDP per worker would increase 0.37%. However, the type of employment opportunities that are available for women and the wages they typically receive must be central consideration for this assumption. According to Cecilia Berlanga Alessio Robles, quote, if wages are considered as indicators of equality, then the rationale behind gender equality as smart economics becomes questionable. The Global Gender Gap Report 2020 shows that even though the educational attainment gender gap has shrunk in sub-Saharan Africa, that is 30%, South Asia 6%, Latin America and Caribbean 1%, the economic participation and remuneration gap remains high with 34%, 64% and 36% respectively. She further notes that economics that are primarily based on the exports of high labor-intensive manufactured goods with high price elasticity benefit from gender inequalities in wages and rely on women's cheap labor. The lowers the unit cost, enhancing competitiveness, attracting investment and driving economic growth. Yes, women have increased their share in the formal labor market, but in low economic countries, this is primarily in highly feminized labor market. Unquote. She further notes that is Cecilia Berlanga Alessio Robles further notes that, quote, women have a reduced representation in capital intensive industries and instead are overrepresented in export-led and labor-intensive manufacturing markets such as the garments and textile industries. Patriarchal gender norms in most low-income countries regard women as secondary earners and primary caregivers, crowding them into a limited number of feminized and precarious occupations which actually have high cost for gender equality. This is why it is important to question what is really meant by gender equality in this context. Unquote. Cecilia Berlanga Alessio Robles further notes that the quote premises that sustain the claim of gender equality as a smart economics are based on assumption and arguments that rely on rigid gender biases and social norms and have a limited understanding of people's everyday experiences. Putting in practice the idea of gender equality as smart economics not only reproduces and reinforces patriarchal norms, but it also prioritizes the instrumental argument of gender equality over the intrinsic. This leaves on a secondary plane the urgent need of addressing long-standing gender inequalities, and it fails to recognize the value that gender equality has in and of itself, justifying it instead for its benefits for economic growth. Unquote. So, if you look at this interrogating gender inequality, we need to understand that there is a premise that sustain the claim of gender equality as smart economics are based on assumption and arguments that rely on rigid gender biases and social norms and have a limited understanding of people's everyday experiences. Putting in practice the idea of gender equality as smart economics not only reinforces patriarchal norms, but it also prioritizes the instrumental argument of gender equality over the intrinsic. This leaves on the secondary plane the urgent need of addressing long-standing gender inequalities, and it fails to recognize the value that gender equality has in and of itself, justifying it instead for the benefits for economic growth. Unquote. Just I am leaving here the quote by Cecilia Berlanga Alessio Robbins. Based on her study, we can conclude that the gender equality as smart economics is based on assumption and rely on rigid gender biases. So we need to address the existing patriarchal norms, and if you don't address the existing patriarchal norms, then it also prioritize the instrumental arguments of gender equality over the intrinsic. So there is an urgent need to address the existing socialization process, patriarchal norms and the everyday experiences of women. Unless and until if you don't address those issues, talking about the gender equality in economic growth, and if you talk about the smart economy by including gender equality, it is a myth. Thank you so much for listening this lecture. Thank you.